So in day 4, we talked about the global tools, which are tools that edit your image as a whole. Today, we're going to be talking about our local tools, which are tools that just go into individual areas of our image that allow us to break down the image into very specific pieces and specific parts where we can edit them individually. It will use some of the basic settings that we see here combined into these tools to give us really good separation for our image. Now, if you had seen prior versions of Adobe Camera Raw, you'll notice that there used to be a brush here. There was also a gradient tool here, and there was also a radial tool here, and now they're gone. Well, actually, they combined everything into this one section called masking. So if you ever heard of adjustment brushes in the past, now it's called masking, and it's absolutely incredible. So let's break this image down. We've got this lighthouse, we've got the foreground. If we look at the exposure here, the foreground is rather dark and the background is rather well exposed. So if I were to try and make it a little bit darker to get some more contrast in the background, our foreground gets too dark. If I were to try to make this a little bit brighter, our foreground looks great, but our background gets too bright. This is where local tools are great because you can compartmentalize and separate things out from the background and the foreground. You can make individual edits how you see fit, and we're going to talk all about that today. So just to start this off, if you're following along, just press the auto button here. Okay. Now we're also going to drop the highlights here, maybe increase the shadows a little bit, and then drop this exposure because it's way too bright there, about right there. Okay. We're going to try and get a balance of the best of both worlds at the basic level first. I always start here first. Try to get the balance of the best of both worlds at the basic level first, then move on to the local tools. It's just going to help your workflow process a little bit better. Let's go ahead and take away the vibrance and take away the saturation because we don't want those boosted. When you hit the auto button, it's automatically going to boost the vibrance and the saturation, which is kind of a pain. So let's go over to this masking section and we'll talk about this. Now, when you click on the masking section, instead of having individual brushes or individual tools over here, they put everything into this one spot called masking, which is really great. It's a really awesome way to work. A lot of people look at this with this new Adobe Camera Raw 14.0, or if you're in Lightroom, it'll look very similar, and they kind of run. They get a little squeamish here, but it's really simple. Okay. Select subject. That would be for people, and it's actually great for people. Select sky. This will allow us to just select the sky in this image and put it on its own individual mask so we can edit that individually. Then we have our brush. We have our linear gradient and our radial gradient, our color range, and our luminance range. We're going to talk about each one of these individually. Now, select subject, I'm going to tell you, it's very similar, if not almost the exact same thing as select sky, but mainly used for, let's say, a portrait or something like that. So I'm not really going to cover that quite as much as I am going to cover select sky because the process of select sky and select subject are almost identical. Okay, so I'm going to press select sky here. And once I press select sky, you're going to see that dilemma that we had. I'm going to go ahead and clear out my old adjustments here. That dilemma that we had of having our background and our foreground being two different exposures is now going to go away because now we have a really good selection for what our sky is in this image. Okay. Now, with this, I have this show overlay on, and by default, your overlay might be set to a red with the opacity down here. I don't like that, because I don't think it gives me a very good view as to what I'm seeing here. So what I do is I put the opacity all the way up and I change that to the color magenta. And the reason why is that magenta is not often a color that we see in our images, so it's really great to see it like this. Anytime I do a color overlay in this course, you're more than likely going to see me use the magenta overlay to be able to see it better. So this just says mask and sky. We can actually rename these as well. I can double click this and rename this sky selection. Now, you couldn't do this in the past, which this is great. It almost adds like layers. And we're going to talk about layers in Photoshop later on in this course, but it almost adds essentially layers to our image here at the raw level. So with this sky selection, I've got this clicked. It's telling me that what is contained within this mask is a selection for the sky. That's what this down arrow is saying. It's saying, hey, we've made a selection for the sky, and this is the sky. Now, I said before that this was a little bit, maybe, I don't know, it's not quite bright enough. So let's go ahead and drop the exposure, make it a little bit darker, but then we'll increase the highlights to make the highlights a little bit brighter, and maybe drop the shadows down a little bit there. maybe increase that contrast just a little bit. Now, the cool thing about this, no pun intended, is that because we have this separated, we can go in and cool it down as well and make that a little bit more on the bluish side. Maybe add a hint of magenta in there too, just to give that more of that punchy kind of blue sky. Now, this is on its own individual area. We are only affecting that background by itself. So as we manipulate these sliders here, it's only affecting the sky in our image. You see that? And that works out really great for this photograph. We can increase that contrast and really get a nice boost in separation between those clouds. And what I'm doing here with these sliders is really just a matter of experimentation. I mean, there is a certain level of known what's going to happen by moving these sliders. But I will tell you that a lot of times in my raw edits, just moving these sliders, I know I want to boost the highlights a little bit to brighten up those clouds. I know I want some more contrast to separate the blue from the clouds, but it's going to be an experimentation process for you. A lot of times you're going to feel like you're just slamming sliders all over the place, and that's okay. Slam sliders around until you start to feel like you're getting to know the software. And that's what I did. That's what everyone does. So now we have the sky selection here. You might say, well, we have a sky selection, but can we get a foreground selection? You can. What we can do here is go to these three little dots and say duplicate sky selection. So now we've got a duplicate sky. That actually looks pretty good, getting a little bit more. Like we've basically just doubled what we just did, okay? So in order to invert this, you can click on the sky selection here, go to the three little dots and select invert. Or while you're on this mask, just press the X key. Now that's going to invert your selection so that now our selection is for the foreground. So I'm going to go ahead and reset these settings here. Now we can brighten up that foreground as we said we wanted to do in the beginning, right? Brighten up the foreground, maybe reduce the highlights that are there, maybe increase the shadows a slight bit to make that a little bit more prominent, and then increase the contrast quite a bit. Now, we can adjust the temperature of this foreground because it's on its own as well. So maybe make that a little bit more on the blue side to take away some of that yellow that's there. And then increase the green a little bit to make some of the green foliage there pop a little bit. So now this says sky selection copy. Let's rename that. So let's call this, instead of sky selection copy, we'll call this foreground. Okay. So that's actually looking pretty good. We got a foreground selection. We got a sky selection. We've individually edited them on their own. This used to be a very difficult process. What we used to have to do is use many different layers of graduated filters with lots of brush work to subtract different areas. And now we don't have to do that. So let's say we want to increase the texture a little bit here in the foreground area. I'm going to go to create new mask. And let's move on down and we'll just make a brush. Now with this brush mask, I haven't done anything to this, so you're not going to see anything in this mask here. So what we're going to need to do is we have a brush size here. The brush size is how big it is in the center of the brush. The feather is how far out it goes from the brush. The flow is how much is going to be applied when we put it on our image, and the density is how much is going to be within that brush. So typically the way I work with this, I'll drop my flow just a little bit here and I'll drop the density just a little bit here. Leave the feather pretty high, and then if I need to make my brush size larger or smaller, I just press the left and right bracket keys and that makes it larger or smaller. So now I'm going to reset these settings here. And when this is set to auto mask, it's going to basically do that selection process for you, where it's kind of where you start this little plus sign. It's going to try not to go outside of it. So I'm going to turn show overlay on to show you this. So I'm just going to click and start painting here. Now you see that plus sign that's on there. You might say, well, Blake, why don't we just use that foreground selection again? Well, this is one of the things I want to show you all the brushes here. So you don't have to use that foreground selection. You can actually just use the brush here too for the mask work. Okay. I'll turn the show overlay off. Now, in order to increase the texture here in that foreground, we'll go down to effects and we can increase the texture that we have in that foreground area there. I can also increase the clarity there, which is going to basically increase the micro contrast details to make those kind of pop out a little bit more. Now, dehaze, that's going to be mainly for images that really do need to be dehazed because they might be hazy. Maybe you shot out of a window or something like that. What it's going to do is going to add some dramatic contrast there, though. So we can use that here as well to add some contrast while we increase that texture. So now we can say, we can double click this and we'll call this brushed texture. Okay. And then we can turn any of these on and off at any given time just by clicking and holding on that eyeball. You can click it and it'll stay there with the preview off. Click it again, the preview's on. or you can click and hold, and when you release, it'll automatically go away. You can do that here as well. If you click and hold, it'll show you that all of the stuff that we've done, all the mask work that we've done is now not visible, okay? So let's add a new mask, and with this one, we're gonna add a linear gradient. Now this linear gradient, let's just say we want to come in from the top of the image and make the top of our image slightly more blue to have that kind of blue sky effect. So I'm gonna go to a linear gradient, and with the linear gradient, this is something that I'm gonna turn show overlay on. When you click and you drag, it's going to create this graduated kind of edge here, okay? And the further you take this edge out, the more graduated it gets. So I'm gonna make that a pretty big graduation, and then I'm gonna click and move this up just like this, okay? So now with this, I want to make the top of the image slightly darker, okay? To draw us into the middle ground a little bit, to kind of match the darkness of the foreground. And then also make it a little bit more on the blue side there. So we get this kind of blue sky feel as we come into the top of the image, into the middle of the image. That's really just to show you what the linear gradient is all about. The linear gradient, we'll just double click this here. We'll call this top of image. Now with this linear gradient here, we can move this down. You'll see much more effect here because it's going to be strong at the top and slowly transition out. That's why we move this up to begin with, to make that slow transition happen from the top all the way down. So it's not so prevalent in our image. This is just too prevalent to me. It's way too prevalent to me. So we can move this down. Okay, we'll put that right about there. So let's make a new one here. Let's make a new mask here. We'll call this a radial gradient. Now the radial gradient, what I love about the radial gradient is that the radial gradient can add what I call spotlights to the image, or can be used for making a vignette for your image as well. So let's just go ahead and click and drag this radial gradient here, and we'll move it right over top of our image. Now it's gonna have the settings from the last thing that we used. So I'm gonna go ahead and reset those settings. And let's say in this little space here, I wanna make things a little bit brighter. I'm just gonna go boom and brighten up that exposure just a little bit, maybe increase those highlights a little bit, maybe decrease those shadows a little bit to make that a little bit more prominent of effect. This kind of creates a flashlight type of effect that we can move around our image. I call them spotlights. A lot of times you'll hear me call them spotlights or refer to them as spotlights in my video tutorials. Now with this, we have a feathering selection here. If I move this feather all the way down, it's going to create a very hard edge. I like to use these almost all the time with the feather at 100%. That way it fools the eye. They don't even know that that spotlight is happening. It becomes more of like a subliminal effect where it's brightening, but you don't even realize it's doing it. So we'll call this, double click it, call it spotlight. Okay. Perfect. Now let's make the same thing, but let's make a vignette for the outside of our image. So what I can do here is I can just duplicate this. I'll duplicate this spotlight, and then I'll click on this and just press X to invert that selection. So now what's going to be affected is the outside of the image and not the inner center of the spotlight. Now for this, I want to create a vignetting type of effect. So let's go ahead and erase all of our settings here. We're going to drop the exposure, make it a little bit darker around the edges. Maybe drop the shadows a little bit. Okay, maybe increase the highlights a little bit there though, because we don't want to lose our highlights in the process of making this vignette. And we can see what that area is going to cover. We'll double click this and call vignette. Now there are other places where you can do a vignette, but I really like doing the vignette here. And you'll see why as we start adding to this whole thing in a second here. So with that, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. I'm going to press and hold the shift key to make that bigger as I move that out. So it makes it bigger from the center and maintains the size that I've worked with there. So now we've got a vignette. We've got a spotlight. If we turn all the things that we've done off, you can see that we've really transformed this image already, haven't we? Looks pretty wonderful. Now let's create a new mask, because now here we have a color range mask and we have a luminance mask. So I want to break those down for you as well. So let's use the color range mask. Now what this is going to do is it's going to give you a mask for a specific color that you select. So you're going to see an eyedropper appear over your image. So I'm going to click right here. Now it's giving us a mask for this color range that we've selected, which is this blue color range that's in the back. Now what's going to dictate the range of this mask is this refine tool here. So let's turn the show overlay on. And as you increase this, you're going to see that the sample color that we selected is this blue color. When we move refine all the way up, it's going to find more colors that are close to that blue color. If we move this all the way down, it's only going to grab blue colors that are very, very close to that sample that we have there. So let's say we want this blue sky to be a little bit more on the blue side. We'll increase this just a little bit to refine that. You can actually grab more than just one color also. You can press and hold shift and add multiple colors to this. So we'll do that. We'll add a little bit more of that blue sky color there. So now let's turn show overlay off. What we want to do with this is, let's say we have a selection for that blue of the sky. Let's make that blue a little bit more on the blue side, just for that selection for that color range. And that looks pretty good there. Now what you're going to see here is that it doesn't look really good in this cloud selection area. And that's where we can do some really interesting things, but I'm going to come back to that. Let's do one more discussion and we'll talk about how we can get rid of that there. So let's call this blue sky sample. Okay. So now let's go ahead and turn this off for a second, and we'll make one more selection here, and that's going to be a luminance range selection. Now the luminance range selection is going to be for tonal values. The last one was for color values. This is going to be for tonal values. There's a couple of ways that you can make this luminance range selection. Let's say we want to make these clouds a little bit more punchy or more on the white side. I can go ahead and click the eyedropper here, and it will tell me what range that is. We can turn the show luminance map on or turn show overlay on, and that will show us what our selection is going to be for that. Now what this is here is this is our luminance range tool. This centerpiece that we have here, the big chunk, that's the selection of the range that we have made. The selection of the range that we have made is that white puffy cloud there. Now its transition and how feathered it is this slider here, okay? So if we move this all the way back over to this side, okay, let's move this centerpiece back to that side. We show luminance on here. You can see this range of selection that we are making here when we have that show luminance on. So let's just do it right for those puffy clouds there, okay? And that'll be that range. This is going to take some experimentation. But what I will tell you here is that it's going to start out like this, okay? So that's going to say that we're selecting almost the entire image from dark all the way to light. If we move this over, we start to make more of a selection just for our highlight areas. You see that? We get that dialed in where we want that selection to be, and then we feather it out. It's a good idea to feather it out so we get a nice smooth transition as it goes outward. Okay, so now we'll reset the settings that we have here, and we'll maybe increase the brightness of those clouds. You see that? And this is just working. This is only working on the clouds and that selection that we have for the clouds. Let's drop the highlights here so that they don't blow out too much, okay? And maybe increase the shadows here of those clouds so that makes them a little bit more puffy. We can also increase the contrast of those clouds so that they start to stand out a little bit more as well. So we'll call this cloud luminance. So let's turn on that blue sky sample again. Now this blue sky sample doesn't look very good because of why? Well, because the selection that it's made for that blue sky is also incorporating a lot of the clouds in it. This is where things get really interesting. I'm going to click on this mask here, which is a blue sky sample. Here you have add and subtract. We're going to subtract the luminance or the clouds from this selection. So let's press the subtract button. When we press subtract, it's going to ask us, what do we want to do? Well, we want to subtract a luminance range. Well, what luminance range do we want to subtract? Here we can make that selection for that area, just like we had before, okay, and move this over to get that feather, okay, from this luminance selection, which if we look at this mask now, this mask has now been drastically reduced. What's happening here? Well, initially it's the color range selection that we have here minus this luminance range selection that we have here, which is creating this mask. Now this blue sky sample becomes a much better selection because we've selected that color blue, we've subtracted the luminance of the clouds, and now we have a much better background for our image. If we turn this on and off, you can see that that blue sky looks great. We turn the cloud luminance on and off. That was what we did beforehand. But look at all the work that we've done through this entire image as a whole. We can turn all of this on Turn all this off and see how we've drastically transformed this image to be more close to what we talked about in the beginning. In the beginning, what did we say our problem was? We wanted to make a good separation from the foreground and the background, but we couldn't do that with the basic settings and the basic settings alone. Now I'll show you this luminance range selection again, because here's our vignette. One of the things that I don't like happening in a vignette where things get darker is this effect happening on my highlights. So let's go ahead and click on this vignette, and we're going to subtract that luminance range again. But this time, I'm going to dial in exactly what I want that luminance range selection to be. I'm going to move this all the way down to my highlights and just make a small feather here. So now this vignette is going to be affecting the outside of the image, but when it affects the outside of the image, it's going to make sure that it's protecting that luminance range from getting that selection, which gives you a really good vignette that will protect those highlight areas no matter how hard you hit this adjustment for the vignette that we have there. Okay. Now, with any of these masks, you can add and subtract how you see fit. Let's say with this spotlight here, we go to the spotlight. Let's say we don't want this spotlight to affect the foreground. What we can do here is we can say subtract and then go to select sky. Now, after we do that, it's going to make sure that that spotlight is only affecting the foreground. So what do we do here? We just press the X key. And when we press X, it will invert that selection. So now this spotlight is only affecting the background. And as we move this radial gradient, it's always going to keep in mind that sky selection to make sure it's always subtracted from that. This is extremely powerful stuff. These types of selections in the past in prior versions of Adobe Camera Raw would have been extremely difficult to do, especially with this speed that we have here. I know we haven't gotten into layers yet because that's happening in Photoshop. But essentially what is happening here is we've created a series of layers of masks that are happening on top of our image to create this effect for the photo as a whole. Now, how does this affect our basic settings? If we go back to our basic settings and we start to experiment with these sliders here, those adjustments are essentially happening on top of the entire stack of all the work that we're doing here. So as we move these adjustments here in our basic settings, it will in turn affect the image with these adjustments here in mind as well. So after you do these, basically the way my workflow starts with an image like this is I would start working with my basic adjustments, then I would go into my masking adjustments, and then I would bounce back into my basic adjustments to get things dialed in exactly where I want them to be for my photograph. And that's essentially how I work with this. This is going to take some experimentation. You might not get it on the very first run through. Okay, I didn't get it on the very first run through either. It took some experimentation. This is an image that's great to experiment with because you have a lot of things that you can do with linear gradients for the top and the bottom, with spotlights, and also with a lot of the luminance range masks as well. I would take the rest of the day before moving into the next lesson to experiment with these mask selection tools on your RAW files, not just this RAW file I'm giving you, but also other RAW files that you may have worked on in the past, so you can get a good understanding of how these masks work. It's going to take experimentation. If I tried to show you everything you could do here, we would be here all day long. This could be an entire 24-hour course just on this masking and the masking alone.